Hello and welcome to Liverpool Online Music and this week's edition of It's All Just Music, Isn't It? I'm Liam Boom and on my right, the wonderful Phil Beale.
Hello.
A bit of harmony there, bit of harmony. I call him Professor Phil Beale, but he doesn't like that. Well, I think he does, but he pretends he doesn't. Anyway, here we are doing what we usually do. But first of all, we're not trying to look alike. I know our garment,
it wasn't deliberate.
Our chosen garments are pure coincidence. The reason I'm wearing my shirt and my waistcoat today is because one of my many fans, hint, hint, contacted me and said, when I wear grey, I blend in too much with the background.
Wow. Whoa.
Well, when you get a mensch like that in your fanzine, like, you've got to react to it, haven't you? So I've decided to wear something a bit more complimentary today, so hopefully it improves the appearance. Anyway, you might think, oh, isn't he cheerful today? He's happy, he's got a big smile. But this big smile is about to disappear rapidly.
Right.
The reason is today's subject is the popular music of the 90s.
Hooray!
No. Not hooray. Misery. My recollection
Excuse me.
of 90s music, I think I slept through most of it, but that certainly at the beginning of the 90s, it seemed so miserable. Everyone seemed to be like moaning and complaining in the music. People were saying, oh, I feel awful, I feel terrible, my life's not worth living. So I kind of, that put me off a bit, to be honest. I mean, you know, your impression, am I right or was it just me? Did you get the impression that the 90s started off rather miserably?
It did, yeah, with the influence of the States rock scene, really. Yeah, it did, yeah, for sure. Yeah. Towards the end of the 80s in America, hair metal was churning up and down, around and around in the washing machine of the States. Rap music was coming to the fore. But in 1990, Dave Grohl, the wonderful, storied and famed Dave Grohl, a teenager, joined a band called Nirvana in Seattle. He moved to Seattle to join this band, and within a year of that, the whole world changed. And what that created, I think, was a whole new genre of rock music, which became the mainstream, and which was very working class in origin. White trash, basically, white trash working class people, young kids who were certainly jobless, possibly even homeless, and therefore their subject matter of their music and the style of their music was quite downer. It was quite downer. But it was soulful. It was full of pain and angst, as you say. For some of us, that's highly attractive, and that went global. It absolutely went global.
Am I right in saying, now this is not like a well thought out theory of mine, it's just like a response and reaction, really. Am I right in saying that around about that time, the late 80s, early 90s, in America, addiction to prescribed pain-killing drugs was at an absolute epidemic?
That's absolutely true. I mean, have you ever heard of Oxycontin Blues by Steve? Steve O. You know, it very much was driven by the pharmaceutical companies.
Definitely, yeah.
Yes,
so I
again would have had an impact.
Well, the impression I got at the time is, wow, you know, all these people in America suffering from these terrible addictions. It's going to come out. Yeah. In different ways somewhere. Yeah. And in the end, a lot of stuff that goes on, you know, in society and with the cultures and stuff comes out in its music.
Yes, it does.
So it seemed to me at the time that, wow, early 90s, what was coming out of America is a load of music saying, oh, my God, we're in a terrible kind of angst-ridden state, which I think was connected a lot with this addiction to painkillers.
You're probably right. We can actually compare decades in that respect.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the drug of the early 60s and the beat boom?
Sure.
And what was the drug of that? Yeah. The drug of that was speed.
Right,
because bands were able to play 12-hour sessions in Germany, particularly in Hamburg.
Right.
So speed became the drug of choice. Towards the end of the decade, of course, the psychedelics took over. And then you come back right to the 70s and the again speed-driven punk of that later part of the 70s. The 80s, it went back to acid again, and acid house in the UK was a massive movement. trip hop became a genre I want to talk about from the 90s.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I think you're right. In American society at that time, I think you're probably right. Painkillers.
Okay,
yeah.
so generally speaking, you know, fashions and trends and things that rise up culturally and socially in America, usually pretty soon after they've risen in America, we see them arriving here. So for me, that all that kind of depressive, angst-ridden kind of, you know, human suffering kind of stuff that came with that American music in the early 90s at the time, I didn't, you know, as a person living in the UK, I didn't immediately think, oh, that's what that's all about. I just thought, what a bunch of, you know, miserable people.
Right.
So I sort of shied away a bit from that kind of music, and I was looking for other stuff to just cheer me up. Or just
It drew me in because of its influences, I think.
Right.
And its influences musically were, let's say, Black Sabbath probably were hugely important to all of the grunge bands that came out of the west coast of the states, of Washington State, Seattle particularly, it was centred on. Bands such as Soundgarden, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, also lots and lots of different examples that were wonderfully creative but were full of angst. So Sabbath was a huge influence. The Beatles' melodicism was part of the melting pot as well, and their own version of punk, which was still surviving in the hinterlands. American punk rock was a very big influence on all of that as well. So you put all those things together, and you end up with this angst-driven grunge music, which I just found highly attractive. And just going back to the state of the people that were perpetrating these crimes, you may like to put it that way. I certainly don't, but you might like to. As you mentioned just before, Kurt Cobain, its prime mover, when their second album, with the first one with Dave Grohl on board, released and released to the world in 1991, and went immediately global on the back of the single Smells Like Teen Spirit. The album was called Nevermind, and as that broke globally, Kurt was living in his car. He was so poor that he was and down, and he was living in his car. So that's the state of mind that drives the lyrics and drives the tenor of the work, you know. And it didn't get much better for Kurt, you know. I mean, the next album went multi-platinum in utero in 1993. They did an MTV Unplugged set, which was, again, globally huge. And he committed suicide shortly after that at the age of 27. So he joined the 27 Club, which includes acolytes such as Jim Morrison, lots of people.
We did mention Hutchins,
Michael Hutchins,
but okay, there isn't an absolute certainty that was a suicide. But you know, that am I just imagining this, or did the 90s have a lot of occasions where we were reading about the death of young popular musicians?
I haven't looked that up really. I don't think so. From my own perspective or memory,
okay.
I was hugely involved in music in the 90s. It was, you asked me actually a few weeks ago when we recorded one of these podcasts. Okay, Phil, you know, what would you lay down as your favourite decade of music? Although I'd grown up and gone through teenagehood and through to adulthood in the 70s, so late 60s and 70s, which are classic decades, my favourite decade from the perspective of the music created within it is the 90s. So I also was starting my own performing, you know, and writing and stuff like that.
Right.
That aspect of my life, so it was a big factor in that as well. But so I was very involved in it all, reading at the time, and taking in, you know, monthly magazines and staying up to date. I don't recall it being a particularly bad decade for suicidal deaths.
Or early deaths or whatever. No, okay, maybe it wasn't. Maybe that's part of, you know, I've ended up with a kind of slightly false memory.
Well, the fact is that it was a very depressive kind of genre that dominated the world of popular music in the first kind of 4 years, really, the decade. And what happened in the UK, I can't speak for the US really beyond that. I mean, I think rap probably just went absolutely massive during the 90s, particularly in the States.
Right.
and I think that therefore kind of took over. I think
Right. Okay.
from when grunge started to die out.
Yeah.
In the UK, it was a different response. UK kids became fed up with it, like you've described your own emotions.
Yeah.
And so they started creating music and bands that were an antidote to American music because they got fed up of how depressive it was.
Yeah.
Cobain died, and that was kind of the ultimate insult almost, you know. My God, that kid never smiled, you know, and he ended up killing himself, which is tragic. So I think UK music rebounded from that and said, fuck that, frankly, we ain't doing that.
Right.
So bands like Supergrass launched.
Ding, 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 ding. We are young.
Absolutely.
We are free.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
That was
that cheered me up when I first heard that. I thought, oh, thank God for that.
Yeah, and Britpop blossomed, you know. And art rock in the form primarily of bands like Blur, again blossomed. Manchester produced fabulous bands like In Spiral Carpets, and then the ultimate really in Oasis. Liverpool had the Lars, you know, and Scotland had Primal Scream, and there were loads and loads of influences going into all this music. A lot of dance influences.
So that's interesting. Okay, I said earlier that often trends and fashions and so on, not just in music but in all sorts of things that start off in America, come over to this country and they're adopted, and we take them on in the main. But it seems like what we're saying about the 90s is the 90s started off with that, just the usual, yeah. This is the trend from America. It's about anxiety. It's about depression. It's about being miserable. It might be connected with addiction to pain-killing drugs in the 80s and 90s, maybe or maybe not. It comes over here. The British listeners, music buyers, start to accept it in the way they almost always accept stuff that arrives from America. Yeah. But at some point, after accepting it for a while, they reach a point where you think, you know what, this is really, really, really miserable and seems to be just going on and on on in misery.
That's right.
So at that point, so does that tell us something about, you know, the difference in British music listeners and American music listeners? Is it the case that the British music fans are more likely to say, wait a minute, we don't care where this has come from and how clever it is, and a lot of it was clever, it's pissing us off and we want something different, so we're just making something different.
Yeah, but I think there are a lot of other, I think there's a lot more diverse, the UK scene, I think, probably. Okay. So there are lots and lots of other influences that are a part of that. But yeah, it definitely was a response to that stoner rock, you know. Absolutely, it was a response.
So was that roughly like in the middle of the 90s, do you think?
About 94, really. Yeah, I think,
then. Okay.
It started to turn. The whole thing started to turn around, and you brought Supergrass out. Personally, I could never bloody stand Supergrass, but my equivalent of that for me was Blur with Parklife, which is again a fantastic upbeat track from probably their second album, I think Parklife was, or second or third or whatever. But and there was that change around, and something else happened at that time towards the mid to late 90s. What else grew in the UK? What other movements took hold of the UK in its grip? And that was Blairism. So that was a massive, massive part of the whole thing. So the end of that brand of conservatism, and the growth of the youthful, attractive Labour Party, getting rid of Clause 4, making itself more acceptable and more just more popular generally. And in 1997, they absolutely they came to power in a landslide election victory, and the world was full of hope.
Right. Okay. Then. Yeah.
And all of a sudden, we had Cool Britannia. Yeah. So we moved from Seattle to London actually, and it became London centric. The Union Jack became, and again an acceptable emblem.
Right. Okay.
So that Jerry Halliwell of the god-awful Spice Girls could wear a UK flag on as a dress, you know, and it was the most popular thing in the world. Really.
Talking about Jerry Halliwell's Union Jack dress, it wasn't a dress. That was not a dress. It was a vest. I've actually got vests that are long. My winter vests go almost down to the back of my knees. I've got vests longer than Jerry Halliwell's dress.
Well, now they've appeared in the conversation, I've got to ask you the question, mate.
Yeah.
Which one was your Spice Girl?
I wasn't interested in the Spice Girls in that way, actually. I had my own Spice Girls in real life.
Your wife, in other words.
The missus, yeah.
The Spice wife.
Oh, yeah. She was bit of curry powder behind her ears. Yeah, it drove me crazy. So I was just thinking before. It sounds like, okay, I think to sum up a little bit, just to help me keep on the ball, kind of thing. I think we said that the 90s started off with a lot of misery coming into the UK from America. A lot of misery, which may or may not have been connected with a really devastating addiction to painkilling drugs back then and so on, that might have influenced it. But it came in, and the Brits did what they usually do when a new thing comes in from America. They embrace it, they grab it, they embrace it, they take it on, they absorb it, they listen to it, and then sometimes they go, hang on, well, that's enough of that.
Let me make an interesting point here, because there was no great British wave of grunge. We bought their music and we adored them and we worshipped them, but we didn't emulate them. The only band that I know of that came from the UK that emulated what they were doing in the States was a band which you and probably 95% of the audience watching this won't have heard of. They were called Bush. And they were huge in America, but they came from the UK. They adopted the styles of the American grunge movement, and they became massive in the States. Didn't sell a record over here. It's quite odd. Yeah. So although it was massively appreciated, adored, and loved, and then they were lionised, and Kurt is still to this day, particularly because of the style of the end of his life, I guess. His suicide. He's a saint, really. He's a musical saint. He's up there with the gods. But no, we didn't try to emulate it.
No, and at some point in the 90s, maybe the mid 90s, we decided we'd had enough of all the misery and the hand wringing and crying and
people like Noel Gallagher said, "I've had enough of this.
I've had enough of this." Okay, so is that about about 95, 96 ish?
94, 95.
95, and then that's where we get Britpop.
That's right.
Appears almost out of nowhere.
Well, seemingly so. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of it was centred on Manchester, because at the end of the 80s, the UK scene was really about an amalgam of the rave scene, the dance rave scene, and rock. So that produced bands such as the Stone Roses, who were hugely popular out of Manchester. The Happy Mondays, similar kind of blend of styles, lots of drugs, massively popular again amongst the youth, particularly again out of Manchester, to say. Centred on the Hacienda Club in Manchester, which was a legend in its own lunchtime, and Factory Records, which was kind of producing a lot of this stuff. Factory died in about 94, I think it was, but they had New Order and bands like that again out of Manchester. So it was quite Manchester centric. Madchester was the epithet, you know. And that influenced a huge amount of British artists that came into the 90s later on. People like Bobby Gillespie, as I say, from Primal Scream, he's a Glaswegian from that scene. He took that dance idiom, added huge slices of rock to it. And took loads of acid, and it became psychedelic. And their Screamadelica, which came out in about 95, I think it was massively influential. Noel Gallagher was roadieing for another Manchester or Madchester band called Inspiral Carpets, who weren't quite as successful, but they had one hit, I think it was. He was actually roadieing and writing his own music on the side at that time. Realised his little brother could actually sing, and created this new band and thought, well, we're going to go places, and went, again, UK-wise, hugely successful. In the south, it was centred on Camden and Bristol. So in Bristol, there was another wonderful combination of styles which came out of Bristol, which was called trip hop. So we didn't really have a rap or hip hop scene in the UK at that point of any great. What's the word I'm looking for? Magnitude. That's right. Yeah, it wasn't the massive influence it is today. But trip hop was coming out of Bristol with bands like Massive Attack, who was superb, and others. Portishead was another great example. So it was trippy. It had beautiful beats. It was great, brilliant music. Very, very soulful. And out of Camden came art rock, really, with bands like Blur and others from that scene. So it was it's quite centred geographically in the UK. And yet, and the popularity of this, because it was upbeat in its styles and its subject matter, it was really, really successful, and very, like you say, it seemed to come out of nowhere. And these bands were, as far as the States were concerned, it did not translate back. And those bands that we're talking about, which are massive icons in the UK, were one-hit wonders, bizarrely.
When they tried to go to the USA,
in the States, that's how they're considered. Oasis are just a one-hit wonder in the States. They don't really get it.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe, I'm just thinking now, okay, in the 90s, mid-90s, Britpop came about because our British popular music fans, listeners, suddenly decided they've had enough of
artists.
all the anxiety and all the stress that had come over from America. We don't want that anymore. We're going to do this happy Britpop.
Yeah.
But presumably that happy Britpop did not translate in America. So the Americans were still in that kind of grungy, I'm depressed.
I'll be honest with you, I don't know much about that, because I lost focus in terms of American music at that time. I was so engaged with what was going on in the UK. I loved Oasis, I loved Blur, I loved Kula Shaker, who was the psychedelic end of it. I loved so many of these bands. Radiohead came out during the course of this, and they became my own personal favourite band of all time. They're still recording today. But in 1997, they brought out their third album, which is called OK Computer. And it's quite interesting. There are lots and lots of parallels with 60s bands, actually, which you can draw. I'm talking about 60s UK bands.
Okay.
So Blur had got the Cockney kind of rock thing going on at one stage of their development, and they were very Kinks-ish. They were in the same way. They got the Kinks going on in a huge way, and Damon Albarn was massively appreciative of Ray Davies and his talent. Of course, Oasis were compared all the time with the Beatles, and they adored the Beatles, and therefore their Beatles influence, without a doubt, came out into their music. I don't think they were copyists at all, but I think they were giving an homage again to the people they loved listening to. So you got and Radiohead, if anything, were probably the Pink Floyd of their day. Really.
Right.
Yeah, I'd make that comparison, and I think that's how important they have been as that. So and they actually are the kind of they break that kind of rule. In that they went global, Radiohead, and they are as popular in the States as they were over here. So they broke that mould, if you like.
Right, okay.
A massively successful band globally.
Yeah.
Excuse me. So again, these are all very subjective things, aren't they, that we're talking about? But that's why it's such a, in my opinion, such a wonderful creative.
Yeah, it is. Once you start sort of looking into the background of the musicians and the styles of music, and you start making links and connections with what was going on in the world or in a particular country, what was happening in America. I know I keep trying to make this link in America about addiction to painkiller and drugs, which was absolutely horrendous.
Yeah.
And it was so horrendous that it must somehow or other have filtered into so many different parts of people's everyday lives.
It was an epidemic.
And so it would definitely get into popular music in America. So once we start looking at, how sometimes musicians and music reacts to each other, and there's a great example here in the 90s of the musicians in the UK sending a message to the musicians in the USA and saying, okay, we've listened to you for the first half of the 90s. We've had enough of that now. We're going to do something different. That's sort of in contrast to what you're doing.
That's right.
And that worked for the British public. Okay,
Yes.
it didn't transfer back to
No, it
America
didn't. No,
because
it
the American public was still having all their angst and problems
Well,
and so on and so
I
forth.
think probably I'm not an expert in this way on this subject, but I think that rap, the rise of Eminem and Jay-Z and so many fabulous acts in the States, particularly, probably took over. I think
Right,
that
okay.
grunge died essentially to a huge degree with Kurt Cobain,
Right.
and something else took over. There was probably something of a void left behind by
Right,
that.
okay.
By the end of that band and its momentum, and it took a lot of so took a lot of filling. And I think that they're the people that stepped in, and started talking in the ways that we've discussed in previous podcasts, about guns and hoes and drugs and stuff, and all that stuff, which we. Okay, it reflected their society, but it had a shelf life, really. That sort of subject matter,
Well, we've seen in different periods in history, maybe the 60s where, the Beatles went to America and America said, wow, we love the Beatles, they're fantastic, and they really, really took off. Yet, looking at the second half of the 90s, the Britpop didn't really transfer to America. So, is there anything that was kind of missing from the late 90s Britpop that meant it was not going to be attractive to the Americans, maybe in the way that the Beatles were attractive to the Americans in the 60s?
Okay, that's quite a difficult question.
Difficult question, is it, Mr. Professor?
Yeah.
Go ahead then. Camera on him. Look at him struggling with this. Okay, maybe the question hasn't got a great deal of value. It's a curiosity that came into my mind. What was it that seemed to make the Americans normally lead a lot in culture and trend and fashion that we here pick up on? Okay, the Beatles were an exception to that. The Americans just said, wow, the Beatles are fantastic, we want them. And then we saw lots of American musicians trying to impersonate the Beatles.
Yeah.
Okay, so this time round with Britpop, which was really successful here, and there's lots of bands here made a fortune and were very, very successful, that didn't transfer.
No.
Okay, so I'm wondering what it was. It might have been something to do with the politics of the times or whatever, that meant that the something that was distinctly British did not sell well to America in the late 90s in the way it had sold really well in the late 60s. And okay, maybe we can't answer that, but I'm curious as to what did the British music have in the 60s that bingo made it work in America that the British music of the late 90s did not have.
Maybe it was considered not particularly original. It could be that.
Oh, right, okay.
We've just discussed.
Or was it too British in some ways, maybe?
I think Blur certainly are.
Right, okay.
I'm not sure about Oasis. Probably, again, might well be that. Right,
okay then.
So, yeah, the revolution happened in Seattle in 1991 and in the years that rippled out from that. That's when the revolution happened, and that's when listening to Poison was just a waste of time thereafter, because it made everything else that preceded it completely irrelevant, and you just couldn't listen to that hairy metal stuff anymore, But I think that the rise of rap, and particularly gangster rap in the States, I think that just was a juggernaut, I think, to be honest with you. I think it just overrode probably everything else, really. And it also incorporated elements of rock. So you started to get, again, more collaborative kind of cross-genre kind of work coming out. So Eminem would have, splashes of AC/DC across his work, and all sorts of things going on like that, so I just think what we were doing was kind of just a little local kind of phenomenon. Really, it changed our world. It brought guitars back to the forefront, which I thought was a great thing.
Right.
But that band, with Radiohead, Oasis kind of led the way with that. But they had a 3-album run, and that was it. Really, it was all over.
Yeah.
They kind of they maintained it into the 2000s up to about the middle of the decade, but it was limping really, to be honest with you, that far. So it wasn't that deep, I don't think. It was quite shallow, really, in lots of ways. I think the music of Radiohead is far more far more. It's art rock, really, so it's got lots more in terms of its influences going on, and they continually change the way they do things. So that's had the legs that Oasis were never going to have. They were a great drunken rock and roll band, you know.
So would you say then that music that is, if you like, about being happy tends to be, if you like, shallower music, and music about being miserable, which has, you know, unlimited kind of depth to it?
Yes, it does.
So sometimes some kind of music can just be too serious and too hard and difficult to maintain an interest in for a long period of time. Then sooner or later,
it's generational as well, I think. I mean, when kids are buying Nevermind by Nirvana, going back and buying the first album because they love it so much, which is probably even more downer. If you're 14, 15, 16 years old, that makes a huge impact on you as a person.
Sure.
On your personality. And you carry that on, really. I don't think you ever lose your love of that.
Right.
It's a very, very... Just, you know, I mean, we talked again about other genres of work, going back down the centuries, and romantic poetry and poets. They're glamorous, aren't they?
Oh,
they're suicidal, a lot of them.
Suicidal, addicted to drugs.
Pain and the way it's expressed is glamorous somehow.
Yeah.
And it attaches its own.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think we, as the consumers of that, you know, we do, preferably in a healthy society, we need to have access to both those things.
Yes.
We need to be able to dip into the misery and the depression and the depths of that. And maybe there's something to be got out of being familiar with that and learning from it. But we then need to be able to turn that off and turn to something which is lighter, maybe a bit shallower, but is more about making you feel good and making you dance around.
Yeah.
And
the tune that's ringing in my head now you mention that is by Guerrillas, which is an offshoot from the Blur movement, and Damon Albarn's side project, and one of the earliest, most popular tracks by that band that hit the world was Feel Good Inc.
Feel Good Inc. Go on, give us a few lines of it, because I'm not sure how it goes. Okay, we'll leave it there, shall we? If you've got a day job, Phil, don't give it up.
That moulds, though, a lot of rap influences, dance influences.
Yeah.
It's the band are a cartoon. Do you remember the Archers?
Yeah, sure.
Well, Guerrillas are essentially
a
multimedia creation. Really, they're not even a band in the real terms. But
so did if you were in the 90s and you decided, rather than just latch onto a particular kind of music you liked and just to absorb that, if you're in the 90s and you set yourself out a target to listen to a broad range of possible different music influences and styles,
retrospectively,
yeah. If you were doing that, would you say the 90s was good because of the range of music that ranged from absolute misery to absolute joy? Did it have that kind of range in it?
I think it did. Yeah. I think it did. I really do. You'd pick out the track you were talking about earlier by Supergrass.
We are young, we are free. Yeah, okay, that one.
Which is, what's that called? It's called, I can't remember what it's called now. And at the other end of that emotional scale, you'd probably place a whole album by Radiohead called The Bends, which was quite shockingly downer, or anything by Nirvana, really, in Utero especially.
Right.
Where some lyrics, one lyric from Heart-Shaped Box is, I'd like to eat your cancer when you turn black.
Right.
I mean, that's pretty dark, isn't it? That's pretty dark.
Sounds dark to me, mister. Yeah, definitely.
But a great tune.
Yeah.
A most incredible tune. Full of power.
I suppose, people like us, me and the Professor here, I'm associate myself with him. Me and the Professor, we might, on occasions, go back and study a decade of music from the past, but most people Don't do that. And when you're living in a decade, you tend not to study the music that's coming at you.
Yeah.
There's so much of it. You tend to grab a bit of it and think, I think this is me. I think this fits in with who and what I am.
Yeah.
And you tend to latch onto that and associate yourself with it and listen maybe purely to that and not to anything else, which I think can be an issue, or it can be a problem in a kind of socio-cultural kind of way if people get too deeply involved. That's why I would always suggest that, you know, you listen to a broader range of music as possible. I know I say it's all just music, isn't it? But when I say that, I'm saying listen to loads of stuff and don't get too fixated
before we close that off,
on one thing.
Yeah, let's just look at other. For example, what about diversity? For example, and that's an important matter. And I think that the 90s was pretty important in the UK from that perspective. More than one band that I can think of had a multicultural constituents. Sure. Ocean Colour Scene, one of my favourites from Birmingham. They'd got a black bass player, and it was just part of the scene, you know. But women as well came to the fore, leading rock bands, bands like Sleeper and Elastica, led by women. Powerful women singer-songwriters. I wouldn't say that was necessarily a UK only thing. I don't know. I can't really relate that across the water really. But that's what was going in the UK. Yeah. And that's very important, really. That again, that youth quake was really going on in this part of the world, and women were coming to the fore and having their say. And playing the guitars and singing, as lead singers, and it was fantastic. It was just all inclusive, and girl fans of music could be felt part of it because they've got their own, role models there. That was huge. I think that was a massive part of what was going on in the 90s. So again, it comes back to why it's one of my favourite decades.
Right. Favourite decade, eh? Okay, I'm having a little bit of a rethink now about the 90s. At first I said it was all miserable and everything, and I just tried to, it's all just music. Arm's length through all the misery and this, that and the other. But it's interesting how it developed and how it changed, how Britpop came in and said, we've had enough of that, let's try this. And there was a lot of other stuff going on. But it just goes to show you that, at the time when you're actually there live, living in a particular decade, you don't necessarily know or have access to everything that's going on. You tend to grab things that you think suit you, your identity, where you live, who you hang around with. And there's more actually to be missed than there's to be had because you're living through it. That's right. But it's great to go back.
Yes, it is.
And say, okay, I've got the opportunity to go back to that decade and listen to like a cross-section of something. Hey, there was a lot of stuff going on. But at the time, almost too much stuff going on. And depending where you look and where you listen for your music, it's easy to miss loads and loads of stuff. That's why I used to like Top of the Pops on telly, because they had everything on.
It was a peak period for Top of the Pops, You'd have bands like Pulp, Elastica, Suede, Ocean Colour Scene, Oasis and Blur.
Sure.
That could be one Thursday night, and you're just thinking this is great.
And it's great for anyone who's watching that show, and especially if you're a teenager and you're at home with your family, your little brother, your little sister, your mum, your dad, your auntie, are all watching that. Everyone's getting an experience that is about a cultural experience. About this is what's coming in from all these different places, and here it is for a moment, all in the one goldfish bowl, and you've got 45 minutes. To take it all in.
But also with the channels pitched in actually and created some great youth-centred but also highly musical shows. I'm thinking of Chris Evans, for example, who came to the fore in the 90s on The Big Breakfast to start with. And then TFI Friday became an absolute must watch because you'd know that he'd have a fantastic band on, or more than one. He'd be interviewing fantastic artists. It'd be really funny. He'd have goofy, wacky stuff going on.
Definitely,
It was, it was not to be missed, and he became a huge cultural figure, massively successful. figure in terms of economically successful and influentially successful. Chris Evans is a massive mover in this. But again, I don't think any of that translated back across the pond, I don't think.
No, it didn't.
But they may have had their own equivalents. I don't really know.
Okay, if we were trying to sum up, you've already told me in advance that the 90s is one of, if not your favourite decade in music.
That's right.
Okay, so I'm accepting that. And I don't think I've said anything that would change your mind. You're still of that. Okay. I started off by saying I think I slept through half of it. And the rest of it, I kept at arm's length because it was full of misery and everything. Although I did have a bit of a bop to the Britpop when that came along. Okay, I've changed your mind a bit. I can say that. I can be honest and say I've changed your mind a bit. Okay, there was more to the 90s than I really picked up on.
Another win for Professor
It's
Beale.
not quite like that. It's not a game. Honestly, he's always like this at the end. You know, it takes
And
one of us to be...
I'm not on top form here, mate. I've got to tell you.
One of us has got to be mature, you know. Anyway, so I've shifted my thoughts a little bit. Okay, maybe the 90s is worth another look, another listen, a cross-section of stuff, definitely. If you were trying to put your finger on, you know, is there one particular really important thing that happened in the 90s that you think then went on to impact the following decade or the next sort of 20 years?
Well, okay. There's probably I won't go overboard, but there's probably more than one. I think one of the great social events of the 90s was that Blur versus Oasis hype that was generated by the media.
Sure.
When they were both about to release their next single.
Right.
And it was like, are you a Stones or a Beatles fan?
No, yeah, similar.
Are you a Blur or an Oasis fan?
Yeah.
Like most of us, I loved them both.
Sure,
but but it was hyped up to that degree. That was a massive kind of cultural event, really. That standoff. So that's one thing I would recall. Tony Blair's swept to power in '97, as we already discussed, and on a wave, a tidal wave of optimism, hope, and aspiration. And I think that when he went to war with Iraq in 2003, unfortunately, that completely evaporated. So that was sadly short-lived.
Yeah.
But for the moment, we had Oasis, we had Noel Gallagher being invited into 10 Downing Street for drinks.
Oh, yeah.
That was significant, you know.
Sure, yeah.
Tony Blair himself, he'd been in a rock band in his youth. That's the first time you could ever say that about one of our prime ministers, and probably the last as well.
Right.
So it was a really shining end to the decade of optimism, of use those adjectives again, optimism, hope, aspiration.
Right.
And anything was possible.
Yeah.
So that's why I loved that decade.
That's why he loved the 90s. Yeah, okay then. So I think we've summed up. Oh, I always get to this point where I say, let's sum up. And then as soon as the cameras stop rolling, I go to the bathroom and say, I've no idea what we've just summed up or what we've just worked out. But I think what we're saying is the 90s, as in many decades, it was, you know, a significant major decade for popular music. And there's loads of brilliant stuff that we
The triumph maybe of optimism over pessimism.
Yeah,
possibly.
Okay, which is cool.
Yeah.
So it just leaves us to decide. I hate this bit. We have to decide what we're going to talk about next time. Is there a particular decade you think we need to look into, or, you know?
What haven't we done? We haven't done the 60s yet, have we?
Not really, no. We touched upon some of the earlier decades, didn't we? We touched about what happened in the 20s, what happened after maybe the war. We touched a little bit on the 70s. We didn't really look at the 60s. Maybe the 60s might be an interesting time to look at, and where it came from, because a lot of people said that the tail end of the 90s was similar to some stuff that happened in the 60s. So maybe the 60s would be... but are we going to do it in fancy dress, though?
No.
I've got a pair.
Look, we've got a uniform now, mate. We've got to stick to it.
I've got a pair of 26-inch flared bell bottoms that I haven't worn since 73. And even then, when I wore them in 73, I got chased by a bunch of skinheads.
No.
Even if I tuck them in my socks. No, I'm going to tuck them in my socks. He won't know. He won't. Right, okay. I'm ready for me to lie down now.
I've enjoyed it again.
It's been good,
good
okay,
fun.
so we're going to say goodbye to everyone at home who's watching, all you thousands of fans. I've been Liam Boom. Professor Beale.
I've been Phil Beale.
We have been It's all just music, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah, that's what we've been. And of course, this is Liverpool Online Music.
It is.
I'm going to try out my closing jingle now. It goes something like this. Da, 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 da. What do you think? If that's edited out, I'm walking out.
If I don't give up the day job, then mate.
Right. Oh, day job. What time is it?
Stick to what you're best at.
I've got a paper round to do 4 o'clock. Say bye-bye, Philip. Say bye-bye. Bye.